On a Wednesday morning in October, the kind that comes in grey and cold and doesn't apologize for it, Marcus Holt stood at the edge of a construction site in rural Pennsylvania and watched his career threaten to slide right into the mud along with everything else. The problem was the machine. Not the one he had brought, the one already there. A 1947 Bucharest Erie cable excavator, 62 tons of iron and steel and rust, that had been used to dig a retention pond on the far corner of the Alderman Farm property 30 years ago and had, sometime during the job, sunk itself into the soft clay shelf below the topsoil and simply refused to come out. The farmer who owned it at the time had tried for a week to move it, given up, and sold the land. The next owner had tried twice and walked away. By the time Marcus Holt arrived, having purchased the 340-acre parcel as the cornerstone of a planned luxury housing development he called Ridgeline Estates, the excavator had been sitting in that pond slowly sinking for nearly 3 decades. From a distance it looked like something prehistoric. The boom arm jutted at an angle over the brown water, frozen mid-motion, like a creature caught in the act of reaching for something it would never touch. The cab was tilted, the tracks were buried somewhere below the surface of the waterline. The whole machine had settled into the earth so completely that the cattails and reed grass had grown up around the undercarriage, threading through the track links, weaving it into the landscape as though the land itself had decided the machine belonged to it now. Marcus stood there in his canvas work jacket, the expensive kind, with the flannel lining and the embroidered company logo on the chest, and looked at it the way a man looks at a bill he can't pay. His site foreman, a square-shouldered man named Dave Pruitt, stood beside him, drinking cold coffee from a thermos and not saying anything useful. Let me tell you about Marcus Holt. He was 44 years old, self-made in the truest sense of the word, the son of a drywall contractor from Altoona who had worked his way through a business degree, gotten into real estate development at 26, and by 40 had built a company worth north of $12 million. He drove a truck that cost more than most people's houses. He wore boots that were made to look worn in, but had never actually been in mud before that morning. He had a way of entering a room or a job site or a conversation that communicated very clearly that he had already calculated the fastest route from where things were to where he needed them to be, and that he expected others to keep up. He was not a cruel man, but he was a certain man. He was certain about his equipment, certain about his methods, certain about what worked and what didn't. And he had the financial statements to back up that certainty. When he bought the Alderman Farm, he knew the excavator was there. He had priced it into his timeline, budgeted 2 days to extract it with his own crew and equipment, and moved on in his head to the next 40 problems on his list. That had been 3 weeks ago. Let me tell you about those 3 weeks. The first attempt used his own company excavator, a 2019 John Deere 470G, with a 47-ton lift capacity and a set of extraction chains that Marcus had paid $6,000 for, specifically because the salesman had told him they were rated for exactly this kind of job. Dave Pruitt ran the machine himself, spending most of a full day working the chains around the submerged undercarriage, getting the geometry right, and then applying steady, increasing tension. The excavator hadn't moved an inch. What had moved was one of the anchor points. The chain had found a corroded bracket on the Bucyrus Erie's rear frame, and when the tension reached its peak, the bracket had simply let go, and $6,000 worth of extraction chain had whipped back across the pond like an angry snake and very nearly taken Dave Pruitt's head off. The second attempt involved a second machine. Marcus called in a rented Liebherr LTM 1200-5.2, a 200-ton capacity mobile crane that had to be brought in on a lowboy trailer from a rental company outside of Pittsburgh. It took a full day just to set it up. The crane operator, a taciturn man named Jeff, who had been doing this for 26 years, walked around the pond for 40 minutes without saying anything, then told Marcus that the problem was not simply the weight of the machine, but the suction created by 30 years of clay consolidation around the tracks. Lifting straight up, he said, would either snap the rigging or leave the top half of the machine behind. He was right on both counts. They tried a modified approach, working the crane in a pendulum motion, trying to break the suction incrementally, and succeeded only in driving the excavator another 8 inches deeper before the crane's outrigger pad on the south side began to sink, and Jeff shut the whole operation down and told Marcus he was done. The $200,000 crane had moved the machine downward. The third attempt was Marcus's most expensive mistake. He hired a specialty firm out of Philadelphia, a company called Hydroforce Recovery, which arrived with a vacuum excavation truck, 2 hydraulic pulling units, and a project manager who charged $400 an hour and used the phrase dynamic extraction methodology 3 times in the first meeting. They spent 4 days rigging the job. They brought in water pumps to drop the pond level. They used the vacuum truck to clear clay from around the tracks. On the morning of the 5th day, with both hydraulic pullers working at a combined tension of 240 tons, the 1947 Bucyrus Erie moved approximately 11 inches to the northeast, rolled slightly to the right, and then settled back into the clay with a sound that Marcus later described as the most defeated noise he had ever heard. 2 hours later, the lead hydraulic line on the primary puller blew at the coupling, spraying hydraulic fluid across 30 feet of pond bank and ending the operation. Hydroforce Recovery sent an invoice for $58,000. The machine was still in the pond. Marcus was standing at the site on a quiet Friday afternoon, doing nothing in particular except looking at the problem, when he became aware that he was not alone. There was a truck parked on the farm road behind him that had not been there 10 minutes ago. It was an old Ford, pale green, rust along the lower panels, the kind of truck that had no right to still be running but clearly was. Beside it stood a man. The man was old, not merely old in the way that people sometimes look older than their years, but old in the way of someone who has earned every year, who carries the decades visibly and without embarrassment. He was perhaps 78, perhaps 82. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and suspenders, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him, turning it slowly as he looked at the pond. He was not in a hurry. He did not look like a man who had been in a hurry in quite some time. He said simply that he had seen the trucks that he had been watching for the past couple of weeks from his property up on the ridge, that he thought he might be able to help. Let me tell you about Earl Meader. Earl was 79 years old and had lived on the same 210 acres his grandfather had homesteaded in 1908. He had never moved away. He had farmed the land with his father, and then with his own 2 hands, and then with his son, and had watched the county change around him over 60 years of living in it. Watched the farms get sold and subdivided, watched the back roads get paved, watched the people who had grown up here leave and not come back. He was not bitter about this. He was observant about it, which is a different thing. Earl had a particular quality that is rare and tends to get rarer as a civilization gets more complicated. He watched. When other people saw a problem and reached immediately for a solution, Earl watched the problem first. He had watched the Hydroforce trucks, watched the crane, watched the whole succession of failed attempts from his ridge, and he had thought about it the way he thought about most things, which was carefully and without hurry, and he had come to a conclusion. He knew a way. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew, not thought, not hoped, but knew that you could do something that everyone around you had declared impossible, not because you had better equipment or more money or more expertise, but because you had a kind of knowledge that lives deeper than any of those things, the kind of knowledge that comes from paying attention for a very long time to the way the physical world actually works. If you have, then you know exactly what Earl Meader looked like, standing at the edge of that pond with his hat in his hands. And if you haven't, try to imagine it, because that quality, the quiet, unshakable certainty rooted in genuine understanding, is one of the rarest things left in this world. Marcus Holt looked at the old man for a moment. Then he looked at the old green truck. Then he looked back at Earl and said politely enough that he appreciated the offer, but that they had already had 3 professional operations fail on this job, including a $200,000 crane, and he was having trouble understanding how an old farmer was going to succeed where all of that had not. Earl said he understood that. He said he wasn't asking Marcus to understand it yet. He just asked if Marcus wanted to lose anything by letting him try. Marcus said no, and he said it the way a tired man agrees to something he doesn't believe in because he has run out of things he does believe in. Then Earl told him what he would need. He would need the area cleared of vehicles along the east side of the pond. He would need 2 days, and if it worked, he asked only that Marcus make a contribution, whatever Marcus thought was fair, to the Harlan County Agricultural Heritage Society, which was trying to restore an old mill on the Creek Road and was about $6,000 short of its goal. Marcus almost smiled. Almost. He told Dave Pruitt to clear the east bank. Then he went and sat in his truck. The next morning, Earl Meader arrived at first light. He arrived not in the green Ford, but in a different configuration entirely. The green Ford was there, yes, but it was pulling a flatbed trailer, and on the flatbed was something that caused Dave Pruitt, standing near the equipment shed, to set down his coffee thermos and stare. Let me tell you about the machine on that trailer. It was a 1932 Altman & Taylor steam traction engine. For those who have never seen one, imagine a locomotive had a very serious conversation with a farm tractor, and the two of them decided to build something together. It was massive, even by modern standards. The rear drive wheels alone stood over 5 feet tall, with iron lugs around the circumference that had been worn smooth by decades of work, and then recut by someone who understood what they were doing. The boiler ran lengthwise along the center of the machine, a horizontal cylinder of riveted steel that had been repainted at some point, black on the boiler jacket, red on the spoked flywheel. But the paint had aged to the color of old photographs. A vertical smokestack rose from the front. A canopy of corrugated tin shaded the operator's platform at the rear. Steel everywhere, iron everywhere, not a single component made of plastic or aluminum. It weighed, according to Earl, approximately 22 tons. Its original purchase price, paid by Earl's grandfather in 1932, had been $930, a sum that in that year represented more than 2 full harvests. The year this machine was built, the Great Depression was 3 years old. The Hindenburg was still 4 years from flying. Franklin Roosevelt had not yet been elected, and Earl's grandfather, a man named Cletus Meader, had driven it off a dealer's lot in Harrisburg and put it to work on the farm the same afternoon, and it had worked for him until 1961, when diesel had made steam economically impractical, and the old engine had been backed into the largest bay of the barn and left. It had sat there for 22 years. Then Earl's father, who was a man of particular sentiment when it came to things built to last, had spent 3 years of weekends restoring it, had replaced the packing on the steam valves, had rebuilt the governor, had relined the firebox, had, by 1986, gotten it running again, and had driven it down the county road to the grain elevator and back just to prove it could be done. Earl had inherited it when his father died in 1999, and he had kept it running in exactly the way his father had taught him. It did not sit idle, it worked. It pulled stumps and moved timber, and occasionally, when some impossible task required something beyond what a modern machine could think to offer, Earl Meader brought it out. Marcus Holt came out of his truck when the trailer arrived. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the machine being winched carefully off the flatbed by Earl's son, a quiet man in his 50s named Robert, who moved around the machine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this since he was 8 years old. Marcus looked at it for a long time. Then he said, at a volume intended to carry to his crew, that he hadn't realized they were bringing in equipment from a museum. Several of the crew laughed. Dave Pruitt laughed. The laughter was not mean-spirited exactly, but it was real, and it was loud enough that Earl could hear it from where he was working. Earl did not look up. Let me tell you about that laugh. It was the laugh of men who measure capability in horsepower ratings and lifting charts and rental invoices. It was the laugh of a generation that had been taught that newer means better, that more expensive means more capable, that the sophistication of a tool is measurable in its complexity. It was not an evil laugh, it was simply an ignorant one. And it was the same laugh, Marcus Holt would later say, that he was most ashamed of in his entire life. Earl straightened up from where he had been checking a fitting and looked at Marcus. He said that the Hydroforce machine had 240 tons of pulling force. He said that was a lot of force. He said that the problem with force, when applied in a straight line to something that does not want to move, is that it tends to either break what it's pulling or break what's doing the pulling. He said that what his machine had was not simply more force, but a different kind of application. He said that this engine, at governed speed, produced a sustained drawbar pull of approximately 18,000 pounds, which was not remarkable by modern standards. But the drum on the winch attached to its drawbar had a cable run that gave it a mechanical advantage of 6-1. And more than that, he said, this machine did not have a hydraulic system that could blow a line or a computer that could cut power to protect itself. It had a fire in its belly and a steam valve and a governor and a man who knew how to read all three. It would pull until the job was done or until something broke. And the things that could break had been built in 1932 to a standard of braking that was considerably higher than what was being built today. He said all of this quietly, without pride, in the tone of a man explaining how a door latch works. Then he went back to his preparations. The setup took most of the day. Earl was not concerned with how long it took. He walked the perimeter of the pond 3 times, studying the angle of the submerged excavator from different positions, occasionally crouching to look at something near the waterline. He drove a series of anchor stakes into the bank using a post driver he pulled from the truck bed. He ran cable, heavy cable, not chain, in a configuration that Marcus's foreman studied for a while before quietly admitting he didn't fully understand the geometry of it. What Earl was doing was not pulling the machine. He was rotating it. He had understood from his ridge with a pair of binoculars something that 3 teams of professionals with modern equipment had missed. The Bucyrus Erie had not sunk straight down. It had settled into the clay on an angle, its right track approximately 14 inches lower than its left, and the clay had consolidated around that angle over 30 years. Every previous attempt had tried to pull it out along a vertical axis, which meant working directly against 30 years of consolidated clay resistance on both sides simultaneously. Earl's cable geometry was designed to rotate the machine back to level first, breaking the clay seal on the low side incrementally, and then draw it out along the angle of least resistance, which ran northeast by approximately 20 degrees. Nobody had thought to look at the angle. By late afternoon, the cable was run. Robert Meader had the steam engine positioned on the east bank, the flywheel turning slowly, the boiler pressure building. The smokestack was producing a steady column of soft grey smoke. The sound the engine made at idle was a slow, deep, rhythmic exhaust note. Not loud, but present in a way that seemed to come from below the ground rather than from the machine itself. Marcus came and stood near the machine for the first time, close enough to feel the heat coming off the boiler jacket. He had stopped making jokes. He was watching Robert Meader work the throttle and the brake with the calm familiarity of a man playing a piano he has played his whole life, and something about that calm was beginning to affect him in a way he could not quite name. Earl came to stand beside him. He said, "Tomorrow morning the ground will be a little softer from the overnight temperature drop. They would start at first light." Marcus asked, "Why not start now?" Earl said, "Because the machine needs to rest, and so do I. Let me tell you about the next 11 minutes. It was 10 minutes past 6 in the morning when Earl Meader engaged the winch drum. The cable came taut with a low musical tone, like a bass string plucked hard, and then went quiet as the slack ran out and the real load came on. Nothing moved. For 2 full minutes the engine worked at increasing throttle, the exhaust note deepening from a rhythm into a sustained thunder, and the cable was so tight it sang in the morning air, and the Bucyrus Erie sat in its clay grave exactly as it had sat for 30 years. Marcus stood with Dave Pruitt. Nobody spoke. Then, at 2 minutes, and perhaps 40 seconds, the water around the right track of the buried excavator moved. Not much. A small disturbance, a subtle push of turbulence, as though something below the surface had shifted its weight. Dave Pruitt said quietly that he had seen that. Marcus said nothing. He was watching Earl. Earl was watching the cable. He made a small adjustment to the throttle, not more power, but a different rhythm, a slight increase pattern that caused the pull to pulse rather than hold constant. He was rocking it, not yanking, not hammering, but rocking, the way you work a nail out of old wood, the way you work a boot out of deep mud, the way you move anything that does not want to move, not with violence, but with patience and persistence and a deep understanding of the thing you're working against. At 4 minutes and some seconds, the right track of the Bucyrus Erie broke the surface. One of Marcus's younger crew members, a 22-year-old named Tyler, who had been openly skeptical the day before, made a sound that was not quite a word. Dave Pruitt put his hand over his mouth. Marcus did not move. Earl kept working the throttle. Robert stood by the steam valve with his hand resting on it, not gripping, just resting, reading the pressure gauge with the peripheral attention of a man who has done this so long the numbers speak to him without requiring his direct focus. At 7 minutes, the left track broke the surface. The machine was level now, or close to it, sitting on top of the clay rather than in it, and Earl shifted his cable geometry. He had rigged a second redirecting pulley to allow for this, which none of the crew had understood when he installed it the day before. And the pull changed from rotational to linear, running northeast at 20 degrees off true, directly along the grain of the excavator's final resting angle. The steam engine exhaust deepened to a sound that Marcus Holt said later he felt in his chest like a second heartbeat. And the Bucyrus Erie began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically. It moved the way glaciers move in time-lapse footage, with a slow and implacable certainty that suggested it was not being forced but had simply decided the time had come. It crossed the pond bank. It came up the slope. The cattails and reed grass that had grown through its tracks tore free of the ground rather than hold it back. The clay released it with a long, deep sound that was something between a crack and a sigh. At 11 minutes and a handful of seconds, the 1947 Bucyrus Erie cable excavator, 62 tons of iron that had defied a $200,000 crane and a $58,000 specialist team and 3 weeks of professional effort, sat on solid ground. Tyler, the 22-year-old, let out a sound that was half a cheer and half a sob. 2 other crew members started clapping. Dave Pruitt turned away and looked at the tree line for a moment. Marcus Holt stood completely still. Earl Meader reached up and pulled the lanyard on the steam whistle. The sound it made was not loud by modern standards. It was not the air horn of a diesel or the siren of a crane spotter. It was a clear, high, carrying note that went out across the October hills and came back as a faint echo from the ridge, and it sounded like something that had been said before, in another time, by other men standing beside other machines on other mornings, and had not stopped being true in all the years between. Marcus found Earl the next afternoon at the farm on the ridge, in the equipment barn where the steam engine had been backed in and was cooling, in the quiet way that things with that much mass cool, slowly and on their own schedule. Earl was checking the packing glands on the steam chest with a wrench and a rag. Marcus stood in the barn doorway for a moment before Earl acknowledged him. Then Earl said he had wondered if he would come. Marcus said he had come to apologize. He said he was sorry for laughing. He said he was sorry for the things he had said about the machine. He said that he had built a career on the idea that the newest and the most expensive was always the best answer, and that standing at the edge of that pond, watching 11 minutes of work undo 3 weeks of his best efforts, had made him feel something he hadn't felt since he was young and newly wrong about something important. Earl set down his wrench. He said that Marcus did not need to apologize to him. He said that Marcus might want to consider apologizing to the idea, which was different. He said that the machine and the method and the understanding behind the method, none of it was his. It had come from his grandfather, who had learned it from the men who built these engines, who had learned it from the study of what work actually is when you get down below all the names you give it. He said that the engine did not pull that excavator out of the pond because it was strong. It pulled it out because it understood the problem. He said, there is a difference between strength and understanding. Modern equipment has an abundance of the first one. It is frequently short on the second. Marcus wrote a check to the Harlan County Agricultural Heritage Society for $25,000. He wrote it in Earl's barn on the hood of the green Ford with the steam engine cooling behind him, and he wrote it for $25,000 because $6,000 was what had been asked for, and he did not feel that $6,000 was adequate to what he had learned. Let me tell you about the years that followed. Earl Meader became, in the particular way of rural places, a kind of legend. Not a famous legend. His name did not appear in newspapers or on websites, but a local one, the kind that gets told at grain elevators and farm auctions and around tables at the diner on Route 36. The story of the steam engine and the pond. The story of the machine that did what the crane could not. People from 2 counties over heard it and came to ask Earl questions, and he answered all of them with the same patient precision he brought to everything. Marcus Holt finished Ridgeline Estates, and it was a successful development, and he made money on it. And that was not the part that changed him. What changed him was subtler. He started arriving at job sites earlier. He started looking at problems longer before reaching for solutions. He fired one project manager who told him something was impossible without being able to explain, in plain physical terms, exactly why. He kept a photograph in his office. He had taken it that morning, without anyone noticing, on his phone, of the steam engine with the cable taut and the Bucyrus Erie just beginning to clear the water, and when people asked about it, he told the story in full, including the part where he laughed. He told the part where he laughed every time, without exception. He said it was the most instructive part. Earl's son Robert took over the farming operation gradually, over the better part of a decade, as Earl's knees and then his back made the physical work increasingly difficult. Earl did not stop working. He simply changed what he worked on. He restored 2 pieces of equipment for the Agricultural Heritage Society. He taught a class at the county vocational school on historical farm machinery once a semester for 6 years. The class was ostensibly about mechanics, but the students who came away from it most changed were the ones who understood it was actually about something else, about the nature of understanding itself, about what it means to know a physical thing deeply rather than simply operate it. Earl Meader passed away on a Sunday morning in March, 12 years after the day at the pond, at the age of 91. The service was held at the Methodist Church in Harlan, and it was attended by more people than the church could comfortably hold, including 2 former students from the vocational school, the director of the Agricultural Heritage Society, Dave Pruitt, and Marcus Holt, who drove 4 hours from Pittsburgh and sat in the second row and did not say much of anything, but stayed until the very end. The steam engine went to Robert. Let me tell you about a morning 7 years after that. Marcus Holt's son, a young man of 26, named Daniel, who had joined the company 2 years prior and was, in the way of sons who grow up watching successful fathers, somewhat impatient and quite confident and very much in love with the specifications of new equipment. Daniel Holt arrived at a job site in Butler County where the company was grading a hillside for a commercial property development, and where a contractor's drilling rig had broken through a shale shelf and sunk to its axles in the wet subsoil beneath, and could not, despite 2 days of effort with 2 modern recovery trucks and a rented hydraulic puller, be extracted. Daniel was on the phone with an equipment company in Cleveland, explaining the situation and asking about a specialized extraction unit when a truck came down the farm road that runs along the south edge of the property. The truck was newer than the old green Ford, but was driven with the same absence of hurry. The man behind the wheel was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with his father's way of looking at a problem first and reaching for anything else second. Robert Meader stepped out of the truck and stood at the edge of the situation and looked at the buried drilling rig for a long time without saying anything. Then he said that he thought he might be able to help. Daniel Holt looked at Robert Meader. He looked at the truck. He looked back at Robert, and he was forming a polite refusal in his mind when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was his father. Daniel answered. Marcus said only 4 words before Daniel could speak. Marcus said, "Listen to the man." Daniel Holt lowered the phone. He looked at Robert Meader with different eyes. Then he asked Robert what he needed. Robert said he needed the south side of the site cleared. He needed a day to set up. And if it worked, he asked for a contribution, whatever Daniel thought was fair, to the Harlan County Agricultural Heritage Society, which was trying to fund a permanent exhibit on the history of steam-powered agriculture and was currently about $8,000 short. The flatbed arrived an hour later. The machine on it was the same one Earl Meader had learned on his father's knee, which his father had learned on his father's knee, which Cletus Meader had driven off a dealer's lot in Harrisburg in 1932 for $930. The boiler was cold. Robert began the long process of building the fire. Some things do not become obsolete. They simply wait for people to remember why they were built.